The slap landed before I even understood what the words meant. One moment, the chandelier was scattering light like broken promises across the ballroom. The next, my cheek burned with the sting of someone young and furious and very familiar. Glass tinkled from a champagne flute someone had dropped. Conversation died to a single startled intake of breath. For a long second, I heard nothing but my pulse. Then Juliet's voice, sharp, cold, above the hush, cut through like an accusation shaped into a sentence. "Give me the keys. Hand them over now." It was a wedding, my son's wedding of all places. 130 faces turned toward us. Ethan's smile froze as if someone had pinched the color from his cheeks. My hand, the one that had been holding a napkin a moment before, went to my face and came away wet with my own tears. My wrist trembled. People stepped back as though some contained animal had been set loose. Someone said, "Is she okay?" And nobody had an answer. When she slapped me, she didn't just touch my skin. She touched a private calendar of memories I had arranged carefully across years. Birthdays I had baked cakes for, school plays I had sat through in folding chairs, winters I had spent knitting scarves I could no longer wear because my hands had ached in the mornings. The slap was public, yes, but what it did afterwards was private and slow. It made me see, with a clarity that felt like a light poured into dark corners, what that demand for my keys really meant. There are injuries that heal quickly. There are others that set a new rhythm in your life. The slap set a rhythm. It marked a before and an after. I left the ballroom that night with my dignity under my arm like a small, fragile coat. And I did something I never imagined I would. I decided I would not be the woman who melted away in private so that others could live in comfort. If this resonates with you, if you know someone who has been pushed, belittled, or made to feel as though their home is a commodity, please share this video with them. They need to know they're not alone. People ask me how it began. There isn't a single day. Abuse that matters isn't usually a headline. It's a seasoning that seeps into everything. Juliet's first visit felt harmless. She arrived with a bouquet, a smile too bright for morning, and an opinion about my curtains. "They're charming," she said, "but maybe a little dated. Have you considered downsizing, Aunt Aurora? Less space would be so freeing." We were not related by blood then. She was Ethan's partner, and so her language at first felt like a younger person speaking in helpful cliches. But those little remarks visited often, always tidy with a "for your own good." "You could feel safer in a single-level place," she'd say, eyes rounding with concern. "These stairs make it harder someday." She watched me in a way that cataloged instead of loved, the way I buttoned my cardigan, the way I put dishes away, as if each small domestic gesture revealed a vulnerability she was charting. There were other clues, small and stingless alone, but hurtful in chorus. She criticized my car, the old thing that had taken me to church, to markets, to the hospital when my mother was sick. She judged my clothes, too busy, too plain, an idea of self that implied deficiency. She called me sweet but set in her ways once, and the words had the warmth of a compliment and the poison of a verdict. Each visit came like a comma in a sentence that, if you looked back, formed an argument against me. The first time an appraiser appeared at my door, I thought it was a coincidence. A smiling man with a clipboard and a polite, rehearsed line about neighborhood trends. He took photos of the garden, of the tile in the kitchen, of the old fireplace. Juliet had insisted he come. "Just to get an idea," she said. "You never know when a little extra cash might make renovations easier for you, Mom." She called me Mom that day with a practiced softness, and my son smiled obligingly. The appraiser left with a packet and a soft smile. The packet looked like innocent paper, but it was the first page of a book I had not chosen to read. Afterwards, there were dinners where Juliet would steer conversation toward the future in tones that made my future sound like a problem to be solved. She suggested senior communities with more support, help with bills. We could handle paying certain things, just temporary. She never said outright she expected my house. She wasn't crude that way. The coercion was more like a tide that lifted little bits of my life and laid them on the shore to be inspected. It was always for your own good. It was always staged with smiles and someone else's convenience. Sometimes Ethan acted confused. He would say, "She worries about things for you," and that was meant to be comforting. Other times he mirrored Juliet's impatience in small flashes, a sigh, an eye roll when a check needed to be written, a gentle but firm insistence that I let them take care of the details. I kept thinking he would see through it, that he'd protect me. I wanted to believe my son was steadier than that. Loving him did not mean turning away when the nails were being driven quietly into the wood of our lives. The pattern accelerated. A friend mentioned they had seen Juliet at a bank, asking about joint accounts. A neighbor reported that the couple had helped me organize my paperwork one afternoon, and when I asked for that afternoon's date, Ethan could not remember. There were texts I found, fragments, half deleted, notes with polite urgency about making things easier. I began to feel watched in my own home, like a guest in the place that should have been my refuge. My instinct was to protect, but protection, I had learned, can become enabling if not done with eyes open. It was Lucy, my niece and a woman with a sharp sense for fairness, who first said, plainly, "They're circling the house, Aunt Aurora. They're not worried about you being comfortable, they're calculating." Lucy is younger than my son by a decade, and she sees things in angles I sometimes miss. She came over one afternoon, took my hands in hers, and said, "We need to get your papers in order, not because you can't, but because you should be the one choosing." I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold while she spoke. The table was the same pine slab Ethan had scraped his knees on as a boy. I could have held on to nostalgia and pretended the currents didn't exist. Instead, Lucy's words landed like a map. "We'll help you sort through your finances. We'll make copies. We will watch. You won't be alone." If someone had told me then that I would hire a private investigator, I would have laughed. My life had been one of small civilities and quiet work, not detective novels and courtroom anticipation. But sometimes the shape of a problem demands new tools. Amelia, my friend who manages properties and understands titles and deeds, recommended Carlos, a man with the patience of someone who had sat through too many stories and the exacting eye of a retired accountant. "He doesn't take sides without facts," she said, "and facts, in cases like these, are lifesavers." Carlos came to my house with a leather briefcase and a soft voice that made it easy to listen even when the truth he carried was hard to bear. He didn't come with grand declarations. He sat at my kitchen table, opened his case, and said, "We will look, we'll document. Your choices will be yours." What we found was not dramatic in the way headlines imagine. There were no secret vaults or treasure chests. Abuse that hides behind family smiles often uses ordinary tools: repeated transfers disguised as loans, guarantees signed quietly on forms that read like helpful paperwork, and a slow conversion of someone else's responsibility into your own dependency. Carlos laid out months of transactions that, when put together, formed a pattern of depletion: small amounts at a time, rent help, unmarked transfers disguised as for convenience, a check here, a wiring there, until the nest egg I had carefully built over decades felt lighter than when I had last looked. There were also guarantees. Juliet's name appeared on a loan form once. A mortgage broker had scribbled a line and marked me as a co-guarantor on what I thought was their loan for a business venture. The papers read to a layperson like mutual help. To someone who knew how to read between the lines, they were a lever. If they default, Carlos said, the responsibility can fall to you if the language is broad enough. He did not dramatize. He simply put his glasses down and folded his hands. That calm made his words worse. Joseph, my neighbor of 30 years, was another witness in the slow-motion play. He had seen Ethan 3 nights when he left the house late and returned early in disarray. He had brought me groceries when I had a cold and quietly mentioned that Juliet had a way of speaking to people that made them feel like burdens. Joseph is the sort of man who remembers small details: the make of a car, the color of a jacket, a phrase said under breath. He became a quiet ally who would testify to moments that looked innocuous alone, but in their totality suggested pressure rather than care. There were darker moves, too. I received a letter, formal, with a law firm's letterhead, that suggested the possibility of a competency hearing. It was couched politely: concern for my ability to manage day-to-day affairs, and an invitation to consider representation. The tone was all honey. The intent, I understood, was to provide a legal route to take control. I felt my throat close reading it. You cannot imagine the chill of seeing your autonomy framed as a problem to be corrected by strangers. The goal was not to care for me. The goal was to create a pathway to the keys. I asked Carlos if such things were common. He said they happened more often than people admitted. Often, he explained, those proceedings are used as leverage. People don't always realize that handing over decision-making to another, even temporarily, can become permanent. He was careful with his words, the kind of careful that comes with years of seeing good intentions morph into harm, so I understood him as a warning and not a promise. We began to assemble a folder, not out of spite, not for revenge, but because evidence makes choices possible. Carlos would say a line many times like a mantra, "Facts protect dignity." He combed my bank statements, cross-referenced deposits and withdrawals, and made copies of anything that looked like an anomaly. Amelia helped pull property records to show title and history. Lucy sorted photocopies into neat stacks labeled with dates. Joseph wrote down recollections, dates, conversations, times. We labeled everything with the crispness of people who no longer wanted a narrative told for them in other people's words. I did something else that felt almost as radical as building a file. I admitted to myself that I had for years made payments on behalf of my son and his partner. I had thought of those transfers as assistance, help because that is what mothers do. But there was a line where help and enabling meet, and I had crossed it without noticing, because love can blind you to the cost. I had sent money, yes, and done it willingly, but my willingness had been married to secrecy and later used as proof against me. I had, in quiet acts of generosity, built a cushion that others walked on and came to expect as their birthright. When they began to pressure me for the house, they could point to my history of giving and present it as proof of helplessness. That realization hurt. It also clarified something essential. Protection is not just about making sure you have legal documents in order. It's about replacing your generosity in the proper context. Generosity that leaves you destitute is not generosity, it's a transaction. I wanted to stop the transactions that were bleeding me dry. One evening, after a day of aligning dates and double-checking signatures, Lucy sat with me under the lamp in the living room. Outside, the streetlight slashed a pale line through the curtains. My hands were folded in my lap. They looked like old maps. "If you want to keep your home," she said quietly, "we have to be ready. That doesn't mean hurting people. It means making sure you stay the author of your life." I thought about the wedding night, the sound of porcelain, the breath hold in the ballroom, Juliet's demand for keys. I thought about what it would mean if someone I had raised, the man who used to come home with pockets full of marbles and stories, stood in a county office and said I could no longer understand my own affairs. I thought of the humiliation of being told, publicly, that the life I'd managed was evidence against me. So we planned. Plan is too kind a word for the practical things we did. We notarized copies of my will. We made sure the chain of titles was clear. We recorded conversations with those who consented to speak in future testimony, and we documented transfers with dates and purposes. We did not craft revenge. We focused on clarity. When you set up your house of life with transparent windows, there is less room for shadows. Carlos recommended a course of action that felt like a middle path. Keep living your life, leave the paperwork with people you trust, and if the need arose, confront the issue in a public place where you would be heard. Public does not mean cruel, he said. It means witness. I liked that, witness over spectacle, because a spectacle feeds nastiness. Witness feeds accountability. There was a legal angle too, but Carlos, recognizing my fatigue with legalese, explained it simply. There are documents that convert suspicion into action. If someone files for a guardianship or competency hearing, they must show cause. If there are bank statements, signatory histories, and witnesses, that cause becomes harder to make. We would not fight with bitterness. We would meet force with fact. In the weeks that followed, I practiced being prepared. That meant having conversations with Ethan that were honest and kind. It meant stating my boundaries out loud, how I intended to spend my money, what I would or would not sign. It meant choosing allies who had steadiness. My son sometimes listened. Other times he floated away as if drawn by a distant current. His face, when he was truly present, held the boy I had known. Other times it held Juliet's shadow. I did not want to pry into my son's heart to see where loyalty lay. I wanted to name my own. The wedding had been a crucible. I left the room with someone else's fingernail marks, not physically, but deeply imprinted. The slap had revealed a hunger that had been hidden behind smiles, a hunger for my home, for the grandeur of property and the stability of ownership. As the months rolled forward, the pressure occasionally flared into small confrontations. Juliet would call on me with a tone that implied urgency. She would show up with grocery bags and then mention casually that if I ever wanted to simplify, she knew a realtor. It was the language of ownership disguised as care. My concealment of certain assets had not been malicious. In my mind, I had been protecting my family from the visibility of wealth, keeping modesty as a safeguard against opportunism. But secrecy, even when wrapped in modesty, can sometimes become a soft pillow for greed. My small safety net, hidden from prying eyes, became a temptation when unscrupulous hands reached for comfort. I had not minded helping. I minded the taking. One night, after a particularly brusque visit in which Juliet insinuated that my memory was slipping, I called Joseph. His voice came over the line like a rock. "Do not let them corner you, Aurora. Come over." He lived a few doors down, and when I arrived, he had set out tea and a plate of cookies, as though we were simply having company. We spoke into the small hours. He told me about a neighbor who'd recently had a similar pressure tactic used on her, about how her family convinced a reluctant elder to sign paperwork and then moved to strip her of autonomy. "Don't let them speak for you," he said again. "If they want your keys, they'll have to take them from you in front of witnesses." I began to think about witnesses. The wedding had shown me how quickly a room could go silent and then swivel in outrage or curiosity. Public exposure can be brutal. It can also be honest. I found myself imagining a different kind of public moment, one where truth wasn't told to humiliate, but to establish boundaries and protect others from the same erosion. The idea of standing up in front of a crowd terrified me, but the humiliation of always shrinking terrified me more. So I rehearsed, not with theatrical flourishes, but quietly, with steady breaths and practice sentences. "This is my home," I would say to myself in the mirror. "My choices are mine." It is curious what power plain language has when it is leaned on consistently. As preparations tightened, the family sensed a shift. There were fewer casual dinners at my place. Ethan texted less frequently. Juliet became direct in her maneuvers, perhaps sensing that the subtlety she relied on was no longer working as smoothly. She began to speak in practicalities with the clacked patience of someone impatient with obstacles.
Once, at a small gathering, she leaned across my living room, and with a smile meant for the camera, she said, "You understand we're only trying to help. There are so many things to sort. We could take care of it all for you." That night, I did not rise to shame or anger. I simply replied, "I appreciate the thought, but I am not ready to hand over decisions that are mine to make." She stiffened in a way that made me think of a bird startled into flight. Ethan's eyes flickered. It was not a victory, it was a test. The competency letter arrived a week later. It was clinical, precise, a court clerk's signature, an attorney's note. Someone had set a process in motion that could, if left unchallenged, produce a permanent reduction of my autonomy. I sat at my kitchen table with the letters shaking in my hands and felt the familiar adrenaline of shock mix with the coolness of resolve. I called Carlos immediately. His voice held neither alarm nor judgment. He said, "We will respond. We will show them the facts." On the morning we decided to act, the sky was a thin, clear blue. There was a bracing quality in it, the kind that tastes of newness. Lucy drove me to the place where we would file documents. Her hands were steady on the wheel. I felt like a woman walking into an unfamiliar room with the intention to sit and speak plainly. It was terrifying and clarifying both. When we arrived at the clerk's office, papers in hand, a clerk asked if I would like a chair. I sat. A tiny kindness grounded me. We did not seek spectacle at that time. We sought legitimacy. We wanted the record to be clear that the decisions about my life were mine to make. Carlos placed the copies of my bank statements, notarized will, and witness notes on the counter. He summarized, with the crispness of someone trained to make a case from facts, repeated transfers, guarantees, and attempts to gather documentation that could be used to claim incompetence. The clerk took the paperwork and stamped it. The stamp was not a finale, it was a safeguard. This is where things accelerated. Once you put evidence into motion, you cannot retract the momentum. The people who had assumed my passivity were forced to face the fact that I was not passive. There were phone calls, some testy, some apologetic and hollow. Juliet called once, and her voice had the thin edge of a woman losing her calm. "Aurora," she said, Why make things hard? We only wanted to help. Help is not a demand, I told her, and it is not an entitlement. Her reply was a silence that said more than words. I understood then that the issue was not simply a matter of care, it was a matter of rights and respect and the stubbornness of a life lived by someone who would not be erased. We were building towards something, though at the time I did not know the final shape. There was a funeral calm in the house that night, as if we had crossed an invisible border.
I packed a small bag, the kind of bag you pack when you think you may sleep elsewhere for a night, but it feels like an armor. I placed the folder we had compiled into a briefcase, and when Carlos arrived that evening, we reviewed, quietly, the sequence of events we might need to present should anything escalate. He did not promise victory. My job, he said, is to make certain the truth is organized. How the court sees it is not in my hands, but organizing facts gives us the best possible stance. He spoke of witnesses and documents and of the constitutional weight a court gives to autonomy. He spoke in a way that turned fear into manageable tasks. That evening, I sat in my favorite chair, the fabric still smelling faintly of lavender from a sachet Lucy had tucked into the cushion years ago, and thought of the wedding, of Juliet's hand slapping my face and her demand for my keys. I thought of how quickly the room had filled with faces, and yet how few had stepped between us. Public humiliation is strange. It reveals us, and yet isolates us in a crowd. There were nights of restless sleep after that. I woke with the prudence of people who has seen how easily life can be rearranged by other hands. In the periphery of my days, a plan formed that was less about punishing anyone and more about establishing a line that would protect not only me, but others who might follow the same path of quiet erosion. I could see suddenly the wider picture. My story was not unique. Older people are often the invisible wells of resources for those who claim to love them. Where secrecy or shame hides assets, exploitation finds fertile ground. I thought about how the wedding would look if I returned. The image of Juliet's hand, the coldness of her demand, had scarred my mind in a way that made my fingers hover over the door handle of the briefcase we had assembled. We could confront her privately. We could do it civilly. We could let the matter fall into the slow river of legal procedure. Or we could stand in a place of witness and show, with paper and testimony and the quiet dignity of evidence, what had been happening. I preferred witness. Witness for me had a moral weight that spectacle lacked. It would not humiliate. It would simply lay the truth where others could see it and choose how they aligned themselves with it. When the call came from the venue to say that Juliet had been asking guests what had been in my briefcase at the wedding, an absurdity, since at that point I had left nothing visible to take, my pulse quickened. The world had begun to rotate on an axis I did not choose, and yet I had the chance to place my feet firmly on the ground. It was time to decide whether to react or to act with strategy. Acting did not mean coldness. It meant clarity. We arranged to return to the ballroom. Not to strike back, not to create a scene for its own sake, but to hold a moment of public accounting in a place where those who had witnessed the slap would also witness the response. Carlos and I agreed that he would present facts calmly, that Joseph would be available as a witness should he be called, and that Lucy would be there to stand with me without shouting or placing herself in harm's way. Amelia had already secured copies of the property title and notes from the appraiser's visit. We had more than emotion. We had evidence. We had, in short, what matters when someone seeks to take a life that is not theirs: transparency. On the morning we planned the return, the house hummed with the small rituals of preparation. I ironed a blouse that felt steady and plain, not flashy. I wanted to look like the woman I had always been: neat, unassuming, careful, not to send a message of wealth or pettiness, but so that my presence would be about the facts and not about a show. The briefcase sat on the dining table. Its edges had softened from use. It looked like a tool, not a weapon. As we drove toward the venue, Lucy sat beside me and held my hand in hers in a small, ordinary way. Carlos was quiet in the back, reviewing notes. My heart beat with a mix of fear and a sheen of calm that comes from being resolved. I had rehearsed the facts, and more importantly, I had rehearsed my voice. There is power in the steady voice of someone who knows their own life. When we stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere tightened the way a string does when plucked. For a few breaths, I felt everyone's attention like weather on my skin. Juliet was there, her makeup perfect, her jaw set. Ethan hovered like someone caught between two tides. People turned to look. I felt the old reflex, the one that wanted me to smile to smooth things. But the smile would have been a lie, and my life had run out of room for lies. Carlos placed the documents on a small table and said simply, "There are facts we think important for these guests to hear." He did not shout. He did not wave the papers. He spoke with the steady cadence of someone used to making dry information clear. He read, he did not accuse. He read statements of transfers properly recorded, of guarantees that implicated me, and of the letter suggesting a competency hearing filed, curiously, by someone close to me. He explained quietly what those things meant in practice: loss of control, risk to property, the danger of decisions made without the owner's consent. He did not tell people how to feel. He told them what had happened. The room changed. Human beings have strange reactions to truth when it lands in a social setting. Some faces flushed hard with embarrassment at having celebrated while the truth lay underfoot. Others looked away. A few had the steadiness of people who trust their own eyes.
Juliet's face changed in ways I could read in the small language of expression, corrosion of composure, the beginning of panic. At one point, she reached for the briefcase as if to take it. Her hand hovered over the edge. For a breath that lengthened into an eternity, I thought she might cause a scene to reclaim the narrative. Instead, she inhaled sharply and stepped back. The slipping of composure can be a revealing thing. It tells you where a plan was brittle. When Carlos finished reading, there was a hush that felt like the room trying to study itself. Someone murmured about calling the authorities. Someone else whispered about the sanctity of marriage parties and social gatherings. Ethan stepped forward then, and for a moment I thought he would stand between us. He did not. He looked at Juliet with something like disbelief, and then at me, eyes searching for the boy who once mended a toy with glue and patience. There was longing there, but there was also distance. Juliet's voice rose then, thin and high. "This is manipulation," she said. "You're trying to ruin us." It was a blunt sentence, meant to dislodge truth with accusation, but people hear what fits their frame. For those who had watched my small life, my quiet patience, the allegations were a shock. For others, the facts were simply that, facts. A few guests came closer, not to gawk, but to offer assistance. Joseph's hand found mine under the table. He squeezed, a small fortress of touch. I did not respond with rage. I said only, "I came here to keep what is mine, and to speak in front of witnesses what has been happening in private." The room listened. I felt the sting of all those years of small indignities, but I also felt a steadiness that comes from choosing yourself back into being. I had been visible in the most painful possible way, but visibility can also be the beginning of repair, the repair of truth, if not always of relationships. After Carlos spoke, and after a flurry of whispered conversations, a feeling settled that was twofold, one of relief at being heard, and another of loss, since actions taken in defense of dignity often cost us relationships. I would learn that cost more in the days to come. For now, the moment had moved the point of the struggle into light. As people began to move, some in angry disapproval and some in concerned curiosity, Juliet's face contorted into something like resolve and then fury. She pointed at me, not belligerent so much as accusing. "You're trying to make us homeless," she said loudly. "You put us in financial danger." That last sentence landed with a clarity that meant my spine straighten. I had indeed made financial choices to help them over the years, choices that were done with love, but in secrecy. Love, it turns out, doesn't protect you from being weaponized when the architecture of generosity is used as evidence against you. I had to accept the fact that my own kindness had been manipulated.
A strange grief rolled through me, not for the money, which had been mine to gift, but for the way my kindness had been turned into a pretext. When Juliet demanded the keys again, this time cross-armed, voice loud enough that the room hummed with the vibration, something inside me that had been quiet for far too long decided not to retreat. I stood and looked at her, and in my voice there was a tiredness, but also a fixed calm. "You will not take what is mine," I said. "You will not dictate my future." The ballroom's hush deepened. For a beat, the world narrowed to our two faces and the space between them. Then, as if on cue, footsteps receded and whispers rose. Some guests left in palpable discomfort. Others stayed close, drawn by the gravity of what had just taken place. I stepped away then, not because I was defeated, but because I needed air. I left with Lucy and Joseph trailing behind like guardians. Outside, the night air smelled of cut grass and alcohol, of stray laughter lingering from the party. The slap, when it hit me, had been a clear incision. Now the community of witnesses had given me room to breathe and to prepare whatever came next. I sat in my car for a long time, the briefcase in my lap, the quiet of the engine a steady hum beneath my breath. The documents inside, copies of transfers, guarantees, property deeds, felt like small, hard truths that could not be softened by charm. I thought of the life that had brought me here, a life of labor, of small joys, of afternoons spent pulling weeds and knitting, a life that had been accumulated in pennies and quiet thrift, and now threatened to be reclassified by others as evidence of weakness. Carlos called. He was calm. He said, "You did the right thing today. We have witnesses, we have records. This will not be solved overnight." He did not overpromise. He never did. His measured voice was the kind of companion one needs when navigating uncertain waters. "There will be turbulence," he said. "There will be attempts to discredit. Be prepared for both." "Prepared how?" I asked, voice small in the car's seclusion. "Prepared by being honest," he said. "Prepared by keeping your life transparent and by having people who will attest to the truth. Prepared by accepting the cost." Cost. There it was. Love often comes with cost. Respect also does. I thought of Ethan, the son who once ran with scraped knees and proud of the marbles he had won at school. I thought of what it would mean to lose him as a presence in my life. Sometimes standing up to protect yourself means losing what you once treasured. The grief of that prospect sat heavy and hot inside my chest. I began the car, the briefcase settled between my knees like a steady companion. Lucy drove us home, and the radio, tuned faintly in the background, played a song that seemed too light for the mood. The house was the same as I'd left it. The curtains, the garden, the old clock on the mantel. I unpacked nothing that night. I sat with the weight of what had unfolded and the knowledge that our response had only begun. In the quiet, I thought about a future I did not yet know the shape of. I thought about the possibility of legal hearings, of the slow machinery of courts and files and clerks. I thought about the dignity I had fought to salvage. I thought about the woman in the kitchen years ago who gave money and time without thought of strings. She was still in me, but now she had grown a spine of sorts. I felt older and more deliberate. My tenderness had not vanished. It had become, paradoxically, more selective. A week later, we would reconvene. We would determine whether to make the documents public, how to shepherd the narrative so it served truth more than spectacle, and whether the cost of confrontation would outweigh the cost of silence. The folder on my dining table would remain there like an accusation and a promise. The keys to my house would remain in my pocket. The living room would continue to hold the echoes of laughter and the shadow of a slap. That night, as I went to bed, I thought of the other women who might be listening to me now, women whose lives had been slowly harvested by polite hands and well-meaning smiles. My throat felt tight, but it was not only fear that lived there. There was also a sense of emerging purpose, the tiny, stubborn ember that turns pain into something useful. I did not yet know how it would look, this purpose. I only knew it felt necessary. I closed my eyes and rehearsed the small sentences I might need in the days ahead. This is my home. I make my own choices. I will not sign away my life. These were not dramatic lines. They were, however, the language of someone reclaiming territory. When dawn arrived, I stood at the window for longer than usual, watching the street wake up. There was a person walking a dog, a child on a bicycle, a newspaper left on a doorstep curling in the breeze. Life, oblivious to our private dramas, moved forward. For all its smallness, that movement gave me courage. The path ahead would not be painless. I would have to face a court, possible estrangement, and the public parsing of private decisions. But there was a consolation in the clear air of daylight. I placed the briefcase in the passenger seat, turned the key in the ignition, and felt the car's engine purr like a promise of motion. We were going back, not to seek revenge, not to humiliate, to lay the facts plainly in front of witnesses, and to set a boundary that would protect not only me, but others who might be lured into the same erosion. As we drove back toward the small hub of the town, my heart beat with a steadiness I had not known I possessed. The slap still stung, but it no longer defined me. I had decided to act, and sometimes deciding is the beginning of reclaiming a life.
We drove back to the ballroom with the quiet that comes when something important has been decided, and nobody is yet certain what the consequences will be.
When we walked in that second time, it felt less like returning to a party and more like entering a small theater whose actors had suddenly found an unscripted moment. People who had laughed an hour before were rearranged into listeners. I set the briefcase on my lap and tried to breathe slowly. It was an odd sensation, fear braided with relief, the kind of relief that only arrives when you stop pretending everything is fine. What followed in the weeks after the ballroom was not dramatic in the way movies imagine drama. It was relentless, procedural, made of phone calls and envelopes, of people who suddenly remembered the truth when it served them, and of people who did not. It began with phone calls to lenders. Carlos, who had the patience of a man used to long fights that are won by the slow accumulation of facts, did what he had promised he would do. He made things visible. He sent letters to banks and mortgage companies, attaching copies of the documents we'd compiled and asking for clarification about guarantees and signatories. He did not manufacture outrage. He asked for records and explanations. Those letters had consequences. Where once signatures had acted like quiet agreements, the lenders paused and asked questions. The mortgage paperwork that named me as a guarantor for something that most definitely did not benefit me was put under review. When creditors saw the pattern, a history of transfers labeled as help and a series of guarantees taken without clear explanation, they stopped treating the situation as a family quarrel and started treating it as a legal matter. That shift made the difference. Institutions are clumsy beasts, but they will often stop a theft when the accounting looks messy enough to risk regulatory trouble. I did not enjoy watching people scramble to save their reputations. I simply appreciated that the scaffolding of exploitation began to creak. Juliet and Ethan did not react with contrition. They reacted with panic. The impulsive composure that had carried them through many social spaces unraveled in small, almost comical ways. Texts sent and deleted, voicemail messages left breathless and full of pleading, a flurry of their own legal calls that made it clear they had, at some point, relied on a future they assumed would be delivered rather than built. There were threats, too, veiled at first. "We'll contest everything," one message said. "You can't make false claims." There were accusations that we had tried to ruin them, that I had embarrassed them publicly. They could call it exposure. We called it truth-telling with witnesses. A storm of gossip hit the town. Social media picked up the story the way Tinder picks up a spark. At first, a trickle of posts, then a longer feed of comments. Someone took a shaky video of the ballroom moment and uploaded it with a short caption. It was not my doing. I had never asked for my life to be unfolded online. But when a private wrong becomes entangled with public records and public spaces, the public tends to lean in. People began to message me, some with support, others with curiosity, and a handful with the small cruelty of strangers who feel distanced enough to judge. Catherine Diaz, a local reporter with a reputation for telling difficult stories cleanly, contacted Carlos. She wanted to know what had happened and why a woman, me, had stood up in a room full of family to present financial documents as though in a small courthouse. When Catherine interviewed me weeks later, she sat across from me in a studio filled with soft light and asked questions the way a surgeon asks about symptoms, precise but compassionate. She did not make me into a caricature of a vindictive mother. She let me speak of the slap, of the demand for keys, the moment that cracked open everything, and of what followed, the slow unspooling of transfers, the bank statements, the frightened calls, the competency letter. She asked about the cost. I told her. I spoke about humiliation, about the ache of having something I had built treated like a commodity, and about the loneliness of feeling scrutinized by the people who were supposed to love you. I was stunned, I said on camera, in a voice that still felt like mine, slapped in front of my son's wedding, told to hand over the keys. That moment was not only violence, it was a declaration. It said, "You are mine to take." The phrase landed in the interview like a marker. It was not vitriol, it was truth. The interview aired, and with it came a second wave of attention. Some letters were kind. "Thank you for speaking up." Others were painful. "You should have fought this privately." I read them all because part of the work of bearing witness is to accept that truth is messy and human reaction is messy too. What mattered was the small contingent of people who came forward to corroborate what we'd presented. Joseph with his notes about late-night departures and hushed voices, Amelia with her recollection of the appraiser and the paperwork, Lucy with her timeline of visits, and the gentle push that led me to make copies instead of silent gifts. The legal process that followed was sober and slow. There were hearings, formal, quiet rooms with wood-paneled walls, the sort of architecture that suggests law is a steady thing. The competency petition that had been floated at one point by unnamed concerns foundered. When someone alleges that a person is unable to manage affairs, the court demands proof. That proof, in our case, was a thin reed against a braided rope of documents, witnesses, and a clear record of my decisions. The judge, patient and deliberate, told the room that the evidence presented by those seeking to assume control was insufficient, and that autonomy is a heavy and protected value. The petition was dismissed. There was a sigh, audible and collective, in the courtroom, relief mixed with the hollow echo of loss. The dismissal did not undo what had been attempted. It did not instantly heal the relationships that had frayed. It did, however, mark the law's recognition that an attempt had been made to shift control of my life to others. The court ordered, in a small but meaningful way, that the attempts to take control be stopped, and it allowed for recovery of some legal fees incurred in defending myself, on the grounds that the proceedings had been used as leverage. Carlos had been clear from the start. Courts do not always fix families, but they can set boundaries that keep people from being taken advantage of. There were other consequences that landed on Juliet and Ethan in different registers. The guarantors and lenders, faced with irregularities and the possibility of liability, put restraints on accounts tied to the questionable paperwork. A loan that had been taken in partnership with the appearance of my name was reviewed and renegotiated. Some creditors pursued restitution for irregular signings. In the space where we had expected to feel triumph, there was instead a quiet knowledge that consequence had landed. I did not take pleasure in that. I took comfort in the enforcement of fairness. The terms of justice are not always neat, and the law is not a dagger to punish. It is a tool to restore balance. Amid the legal aftermath, something else occurred that surprised me. Neighbors and strangers reached out with their stories. A woman I'd never met sent a message saying her mother had once been pressured similarly and had lost both home and dignity. An 80-year-old man dropped by with a pile of newspapers and insisted on bringing chicken soup. These small things accumulated into an unmistakable fact. My story was not unique. Older people, particularly women of a certain quiet disposition, are frequently the subjects of strategies that begin with kindness and end with appropriation. Lucy and I started meeting more regularly. The practical work of setting up boundaries and the slower work of converting pain into purpose sat side by side on our kitchen table. "What if we do something real with this?" she asked me one evening, as we sorted through a stack of letters from people asking for help. Her suggestion was not born of grandiosity. It was born of the practical recognition that the problem we had encountered was one that could happen again and again, and that the gap between needing help and finding help was wide. So we started small. We set up a modest nonprofit. We named it Dignity Home, because names matter and because I wanted the most basic term restored to those who came to us: dignity. It was not a grand launch with champagne. It was 2 women with a laptop, a stack of business cards, and enough paperwork to make us feel bureaucratically adult. Lucy handled outreach. Amelia helped find affordable office space. Joseph offered to pick up packages and act as an extra pair of hands when we hosted meetings. Carlos advised on the legalities of nonprofit formation, always cautious to point out that his role was to make sure we did things by the book. We were careful with our language. We would advocate, educate, and offer resources, but we would not promise legal solutions. Our mission was to reduce the need for people to stand alone when decisions were made about their lives. The Foundation's first few months were a blur of intake forms, phone calls, and community talks. We ran workshops on how to keep records, what questions to ask when someone offered to help, and how to find trustworthy advisors. We collaborated with a small legal clinic that offered sliding scale consultations and connected people to verified financial counselors. Those who came to us often had the same story in different rhythms: a daughter-in-law with a smile and a plan, a son with divided loyalties, quiet transfers that had been explained as temporary help. We helped people compile documents the way we had compiled my briefcase: copies of bank statements, timelines, witness notes. We did not give legal advice. We helped people create clarity. The work was its own kind of healing. I sat in rooms with women who held their hands the way I had when Lucy first suggested assembling my records, like small maps. They told me their stories, and I listened, not as someone who had it all figured out, but as someone who had been in the room where a private wrong turned public, and who knew the particular kind of relief that comes from being believed. We set up support groups for adult children who wanted to break cycles of dependency, and for elders learning to set boundaries. We partnered with a local bank willing to offer an information session about how to avoid predatory practices. Little by little, the Dignity Home filled its calendar and its mailbox. There were hard days. Sometimes I woke up to letters from Ethan, short, halting things that sounded like the boy who used to leave notes under my door apologizing for small cruelties. "Mom," one message read, "I miss you. Can we talk?" He called once and left a voicemail that began in a voice I recognized and ended somewhere distant. I returned his call and we spoke quietly. His words were a mixture of shame and defense. He would say, "I was in a difficult place," and then he would retreat. I wanted to give him space to find his way back, but I also knew that safety required boundaries. We had gone through something that could not be smoothed over by a single conversation. There were pragmatic decisions, too.
In consultation with Carlos and my advisors, I adjusted my estate plans, not out of spite, but to place my resources where they would be protected and used to head off the kind of exploitation I had experienced. I left clear instructions for my affairs and added provisions to support programs that protect elders' autonomy. Some people interpreted this as punishment. I saw it as stewardship. My life had produced resources, and I wanted them to serve purpose, not predation. Lucy would sometimes tease me about being frugal to the end, but she understood the real point. Planning with clarity leaves less room for others to seize control. As the months went by, the public attention settled into a steady hum. Catherine Diaz followed up with pieces that focused less on salacious detail and more on education, how to recognize financial manipulation, what red flags to watch for, stories of neighbors who had helped others quietly. The tone of coverage changed when we began partnering with other local organizations, church groups, senior centers, neighborhood associations, to hold workshops where people could come without shame and learn practical steps, like whom to call for advice and how to document conversations. The legal fallout for Juliet and Ethan tapered in different ways. There were attempts to repair the damage through negotiation in private settings that included lawyers and mediators. I did not attend every meeting. I chose deliberately which doors to open and which to keep closed. Some of the contact that came from my son over the years was sincere and tender in parts. Other contact felt like the polite reach of someone negotiating reputation rather than offering real remorse. I tried to hold both realities, the human ache of possibly losing my son and the necessity of keeping myself safe. Loving someone does not mean you must accept being hurt. There were nights I thought about how small mistakes and large misreadings had accumulated into the situation we faced. I thought about the motherhood that reflexively offers aid and the cultural assumptions that make elders easy targets for persuasion. I thought, too, about the quiet ways communities can be guardrails if they choose to be. Joseph, who had been my neighbor longer than anyone else in my life, became a volunteer at Dignity Home. He would sit in our intake sessions and remind people to breathe, to take one step at a time. He told stories of the ordinary decency that often averts disaster. Someone noticing a change in a neighbor's mail, a church member offering to sit through a meeting, a friend rescuing a stack of papers before they could be surreptitiously signed away. 2 years after the slap, the noise had settled into something resembling a new normal. There had been a handful of legal victories. The competency petition had been dismissed. A court had ordered partial restitution for the legal fees we had incurred when the attempts to take control had been made. And, importantly, an order had required that any future attempts to gain control must pass through a stricter evidentiary standard. Those were technical outcomes. The deeper changes had been social and personal. I had not regained a son in the way I had once imagined. Ethan came around occasionally, at first with a bouquet, then later with a letter, then with sporadic calls. Each contact felt like a stone tossed against a window. It made a sound, but it did not always break through the glass. I wanted to hold the possibility of repair open, but I also wanted to protect the dignity I had reclaimed. Dignity Home grew slowly. We started with a handful of small grants and a lot of volunteer hours. We published a short guide about the signs of financial exploitation and distributed it at libraries and senior centers. We held trainings for bank tellers and real estate agents, frontline people who often see the first signs of manipulation. We created a buddy system that paired volunteers with elders who wanted help organizing paperwork or understanding what they had signed. The work was humbling and real. It required patience and concrete action. I loved being in rooms where a woman could say, "I didn't know this was happening to me," and leave with a friend, a list of resources, and a sense that she was not alone. There were also personal transformations. I found myself speaking at events, sometimes in church basements, some nights at luncheon rooms, sometimes on larger stages where a microphone amplified the quiet, steady voice I'd grown into. When I spoke, I did not aim to be a cautionary tale. I aimed to offer a map. You do not need to be ashamed of what happened, I would say, and you do not need to shoulder it alone. Those sentences came out of a lifetime of being asked to carry burdens quietly. Now I tried to model a different way, when we're seeking help and building fences around your life are signs of wisdom rather than weakness. We took pains not to gloat. There was no jubilation in watching a family unspool. The loss of my son's presence in my life was its own sorrow, but there was also a hard-won peace that comes from living in a world whose rules you helped make clear. I sleep better than I did in the months before we took action, not because the world is now perfectly safe, but because I have fewer unknowns pressing on me. I can see, file, and respond instead of letting things be assumed away. Sometimes, walking through town, people recognize me and offer a small nod or a story about their own mother, a neighbor, a friend. "You helped us," a woman told me once, her eyes bright with gratitude. My aunt signed away everything, but we caught it in time because we learned what to look for.
Those words are the quiet currency of the work, the exchanges that keep me going when the grief for lost relationships surges again. There are moments of loneliness. Holidays are a particular kind of ache. They used to be full of noise, family voices, plates clinking, a child falling asleep on the couch near the foot of the Christmas tree. Now they are quieter. I have learned to make new rituals, small dinners with Lucy and Joseph, an invitation once a year to neighbors who do not have family around, a volunteer thank you tea. These rituals are not replacements for what was lost. They are choices I make to live richly in the absence of what used to be. People sometimes ask if I regret how public I made the truth. There are days I think I would rather have kept everything private and solved the problem in some gentler, less exposed way. Then I remember the woman who wrote me from across the state, who said she had been saved because seeing someone else speak up gave her language for her own situation. I remember Joseph's steady presence at the ballroom, Amelia's unwavering help with documents, and Lucy's insistence that my generosity should not be weaponized. For every moment of regret, there are multiple moments of purpose. The cost of speaking was high, but the cost of silence would have been higher for others. A few times I have seen images of Juliet and Ethan online, blurred and angry profiles of a life that has narrowed into the complications they chose. I don't spend much time there. There is a discipline to being present in your own life rather than haunted by the images of a life unraveling for others. Sometimes I feel a flash of anger. More often there is a melancholy for what might have been. But I have found that the sharpness of those feelings dulls the more I turn my energy outward. 2 years on, the foundation has helped dozens of families and inspired a handful of policy conversations at town hall meetings. We were part of a local campaign that created clearer guidelines for banks when elderly customers seek to modify accounts or add signatories. We held a workshop with a group of social workers who now carry our pamphlets in their cars. Those are small victories, yet they make an arrangement in the world slightly more just. There is dignity in that repetitive, unglamorous work. On a personal level, I have reclaimed my home as a sanctuary. The keys have stayed in a pocket I know well. I have new locks, yes, updated not out of paranoia, but out of prudence. I planted a small herb garden out back, a row of lavender that hums bees into the air in summer. At night, I sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea and sometimes write letters to people who have reached out asking for help. I write slowly now, measured sentences that don't try to fix everything, but that carry warmth and clear counsel. Document, trust someone, and do not be ashamed to ask for assistance. It is practical and modest, like many of the things I value.
Ethan and I have not found our way back to what we once were. There have been a few heartfelt conversations, one in which he cried and said, "I didn't know how deep things had gone." And there have been attempts at reconciliation that foundered on ambivalence. I hold on to the possibility that with time and work, he may become the man I once recognized in small ways. But I cannot make that the measure of my life. My life now is held in the steadier things I help build for others, and in that work I find meaning. People sometimes ask me, gently and with curiosity, "Were you never afraid?" I was often afraid. Fear is an honest companion of people who have been surprised by violence. But fear is not a sentence. It can be a teacher. The slap taught me that some lines are non-negotiable. It taught me that older people's autonomy must be fiercely guarded, and that secrecy, however well-intentioned, can become the soil where exploitation grows. It taught me how to translate private pain into public protection. If you have listened this far, you know the central image of my story: a ballroom, a slap, a demand for keys. That moment was crystal clear and terrible in its simplicity. It stunned me, yes, but it also shifted me.
from stunned to steady, from private embarrassment to public advocacy, from small acts of generosity that left me vulnerable to larger acts of stewardship that protect others. I do not present my life as flawless or my choices as moral perfection. I present them as a path that led me from being smaller than my story to being able to shape what comes next for others. If this story resonates with you, or if you know someone who needs help, please consider sharing it. Not to relive someone else's pain, but because someone out there might recognize the pattern before it tightens. If you'd like to learn more about the work we do, or to support elder protection efforts, visit our foundation page. We use donations to fund free consultations, educational materials, and modest grants to help people access professional advice when they need it. Your support means fewer people will have to find their voice the way I did, through a public humiliation that forced a reckoning. There is no tidy ending to these things. There is no restoring what time has moved. But there is repair of a kind. The repair of boundaries, the repair of community knowledge, the repair of a life lived with intention. 2 years on, I live quieter days and busier hours of work. I have a garden, a folder of orderly paperwork, and a small office where neighbors come to ask questions. I have friends who have become family in ways that matter. I have peace that is not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. When I think of that night, of Juliet's hand and the sound of a crystal glass as it hit the floor, I still feel the sting, but I also feel the steadiness of the decision that followed. I was stunned, then I acted. I chose dignity over disappearance. I chose clarity over secrecy. It cost me a relationship, yes, and that cost is real and heavy. But it gave me other things, a mission, a community, and the knowledge that at the end of my days, the resources I have will protect dignity rather than enable its erosion. If you find yourself in a similar place, pushed, shamed, pressured, please know 2 things. You do not have to be silent, and you do not have to face it alone. There are people who will sit with your paperwork, who will help you find witnesses, who will teach you how to make your choices visible when visibility is the only protection. And if you can, consider supporting organizations that do this work. Dignity can be fragile. It deserves defenders. I still keep the keys in my pocket. Sometimes I jingle them just to hear the small metallic sound that says, "This is mine." Not because possessions define us, but because control over one's own life is sacred. The slap was a violence I never imagined. The demand for my keys was an act of entitlement disguised as care. But the story that followed, the gathering of papers, the calm reading of facts, the slow turn of community and law toward justice, has become a story I can live with. I stand now on firmer ground. I hope, with everything in me, that nobody else will be surprised into losing their dignity the way I was. If this story helped you, if it gave you courage, share it with someone who may need it. If you want to learn more about how to support elder rights and the work we've begun, visit the Dignity homepage and consider subscribing for updates on workshops and resources. We are small, we are steady, and we are here for anyone who needs a place to begin again.